Good day to you, my subjects. Today we talk about healers. We talked a couple of days ago about the tanks in Mythic Plus, so now we're going to be talking about the healers in raids, just to alternate it a little bit. A lot of these things are going to be pertinent to Mythic Plus as well, but not in the same level, not in the same quantity. We have gone through enough of Castronatria, enough logs, enough participation from players to gauge how the healers are doing right now. Before we start going a little bit more in depth on all the 6 different healers, we have to start first with the main problem. This was the problem from BfA, and you can say from Legion, and you can say even further back in Worlds of Draenor, which is the split. The split between who has it and who doesn't. I am talking about damage reduction. Restoration Shaman with Spirit Link Totem, Discipline Priest with Barrier, and now with Spirit Shell, which can do something similar, and then Holy Paladin with Aura Mastery, which is going to empower Devotion Aura to be a 15% damage reduction. These are the 3 healers that have had this type of benefit, this type of leg up over the other 3 healers: Mistweaver Monk, Restoration Druid, and Holy Priest. So in the previous expansions, we have had this situation where you would fill your healing roster with specs that had damage reduction at their disposal, and then you would fill the last couple with specs that didn't. Historically, that slot has gone to Restoration Druid, because Restoration Druid has had very solid, very high throughput. So actual healing, not damage reduction, not preventing the damage, but actually healing people being hurt. So the predictions for this expansion, which I shared myself in one of my videos about the ballsy calls, the risky calls, the feely crafty calls without having to use facts and logic, I mentioned that looking at the damage profile of Castronatria, we would have had less bosses that required damage reduction. Essentially less spikes of damage, which allowed you to be able to heal throughout the entire encounter at the same rate, rather than needing a very short, concentrated burst of healing. Whenever that happens, you always want damage reduction, because it's always better to prevent the damage before you even have to think about healing it. Now, what we have to talk about is that even though this has actually turned out to be true, which we will see later, the representation of healers has not changed. The Discipline Priest and Restoration Shaman are still very popular, and Holy Paladin has dropped off compared to BfA because of their predictable loss of power thanks to the borrowed powers they had in BfA. From Ineffable Truth corruptions to their very high uptime on wings and very strong Glimmer as an Azerite trait, which has now been turned into a talent. It is less powerful, it is less encompassing for everything they do, or they used to do in BfA, so they lost some representation, but they are still very popular. And the throughput specs have not really risen. In fact, Mistweaver Monk Holy Priest has raised its representation by quite a bit, but it is still quite far back compared to the other healers, the top 3. And then we even have a significant drop in Restoration Druid. This is particularly bad because we are in an expansion where we are having, more often than not, compared to BfA, 5 healers in the raid. In BfA, you have been taught to even see 3 healers healing for encounters for progress. Now, many of the fights are going to require 5, and even with 5 healers, there is a struggle in fitting even just one of these non-damage reduction healers. So let's go over the specs and what exactly has been going on with them from BfA to Shadowlands and how are they doing right now and why. So we have to start, of course, towards the bottom. So we're going to be starting with the Holy Priest and the Mistweaver Monk. Holy Priest, compared to BfA, has changed a bit in their healing layout, in how they heal. They have much less of that Prayer of Healing spamming and extremely high Echo of Light overall healing. Now it's a little bit more balanced. However, even though this changed a little bit, they are still in the same situation. A lot of this healing, for example, is, I want to say, fake. The renew you see here is essentially just happening because of Holy War Salvation. Their only claim to fame in a raid encounter is when they use this cooldown. The problem with this cooldown is that, of course, it is still entirely throughput. No damage reduction whatsoever. So they remain, in this way, very similar to BfA. They remain a spec that can have pretty high throughput, very high HPS, continuous HPS. The problem is, their lack of cooldowns. Divine Hymn is a support cooldown. Hymn of Hope is even worse, doesn't even count as a cooldown. And then they are stuck with just Holy War Salvation. Their assortment of pretty bad mobility, very poor survivability is still there. They have been helped by the fact that they have been given some more instant cast abilities, no longer having to hard cast a lot of their abilities. Their Prayer of Healing is instant, their Circle of Healing is instant, so they do have quite a few more abilities they can use on the move, but their problem is the same. They have very poor flexibility. When you have a healer that can only have big spikes of healing tied to a 12-minute cooldown, of course I'm being dramatic, Holy War Salvation can have, if you're pretty quick, a 4-minute cooldown, still, that is very big. When you are a healing officer and you want to start spreading your cooldowns for all the higher damage phases, you start looking and you're like, okay, we can put Spirit Link here, we can put Healing Tide here, we can put Ascendance and Earthenwall Totem here, and then you look at the Holy Priest and you're like, okay, I guess we put Salvation here and then the fight is over. Great. It makes it pretty hard to be useful this way. The Holy Priest can still say, but if you look at it, my HPS is very high, which is true, but as we know, not all damage is born equal. There is some damage that is going to be more important to heal than other types of damage, other situations. And generally speaking, specs that have more tools to heal that damage when it happens are going to be the better ones. Not just because of the damage reduction. We will see what I'm talking about. Because when you look at Mistweaver Monk, it is basically the same situation. I thought this could happen in the beta. I didn't put too much stock into it at the time, but it is happening, you know. Ancient Teachings of the Monastery Legendary is what many Mistweaver Monks are using in raids together with Rising Mist and things like the Rising Sun Revival. So they are being basically Fist Weavers. They are doing damage and healing at the same time. Number one, their damage is shit as a healer. It's nothing close to, for example, a Holy Paladin. So that is the first problem. For this spec to be more viable, if they actually had competitive damage like the ones of a Holy Paladin, even the ones of a Discipline Priest, but they don't. So that's the main issue. Now, on to the other issue. When you look at the healing, basically, this is sad to look at. Enveloping Breath for Mistweaver Monk is essentially this. That's the only time they're going to be using Enveloping Breath, because Enveloping Breath happens when they use their big cooldown, their Yulon or their Chi-Ji. So the rest of the fight is just spent keeping Refreshing Jade Wind up and using Essence Font on cooldown. It is, first of all, it is boring, and second of all, it is not very effective. Mistweaver Monk is in the same problem of Holy Priest. Chi-Ji or Yulon have a 3-minute cooldown. They don't have short 30 to 40 to 50 second 1-minute cooldown that they can use each and every high burst phase that they want to heal. They are stuck to this huge cooldown that they can't maneuver very well inside of a fight. And then they have Revival as well, which is also very big as a cooldown, but it is not very powerful compared to other big cooldowns we will see from the other specs. They can still do pretty good HPS, consistent, continuous HPS. You can go in the logs and see Mistweaver Monk having pretty good HPS, but then remember, not all damage taken is equal. Some of this damage is going to be much more important to heal, and Mistweaver Monk is too stuck together with Holy Priest in big cooldowns and not enough versatility in using their cooldowns. In some cases, it's not enough versatility. In other cases, it's simply not having enough cooldowns. Now we move on to the Gateway spec. The spec that doesn't have damage reduction cooldowns, but has done and has been part of raid progression for a long time. The only exception, aside of Holy Priest and Mistweaver Monk, is Restoration Druid. And Restoration Druid was already performing better than these two specs in BfA. It was already more popular, more represented, of course also thanks to their popularity and strength in Mythic Plus. And the main advantage of Restoration Druid, when you look at this healing done by a Druid, it seems like the same as previous expansions, right? They have a ton of Rejuvenation casts, they use Wild Growth a lot of time, more often than not on cooldown, a chunk of healing from their Tranquility and a chunk of healing from their passive Efflorescence and Spring Blossoms on the ground. However, it is worth highlighting that compared to Mistweaver and compared to Holy, they are much more versatile in their cooldowns, because they do have Tranquility, which does seem in line with the shit cooldowns of the other healers, because it's a 3-minute cooldown and it's pretty big, and now you have to channel it as well. You are back to channel it in place, so that's pretty annoying. However, thanks to their talents, they have the option to go for Incarnation, and they have the option to go for Flourish. That's another 3-minute cooldown and another extra 90-second cooldown. And on top of that, they are Night Fae, which means they have Convoke the Spirits, which also does bring a pretty good burst of HPS when they use it. So unlike Mistweaver, which more or less just has the Celestial Guardian and the Revival, which is poor, compared to Tranquility, and their Covenant ability doesn't give them any extra super good burst of healing. You have the Holy Priests, which are in a similar situation with very limited amount of cooldowns, and the one they have is very long. Restoration Druid with Incarnation, with Tranquility, with Flourish, and with Convoke the Spirits just has way more things they can use to keep up their consistent HPS, and cooldowns that they can use in big and important situations. They have not gotten particularly better to play. You know, before this expansion, there was some excitement. I think Memory of the Mother 3 is pretty cool to play if you're a Druid, because it sort of, you know, changes the way you play a little bit. Your proc, your extra mega empowered rejuvenation or regrowth can shake up your rotation a little bit, but it's not being played. Instead, the more passive, soulless, and boring legendary, the Vision of Unending Growth for just free rejuves spreading on the entire raid is what's being played. You know, the extra min-maxing, because you're not playing a lot of the time with Soul of the Forest, doesn't even make you use Swiftmend a lot. So you're literally even more of a rejuvenation bot now than before. So it hasn't exactly gotten better compared to BfA, at least in terms of playstyle. You can say that it basically just gotten, as a big change, Convoke the Spirits, pretty much. So they remained the better of the throughput healers like before, but they also remained worse than all of the damage reduction healers like before, which is also possibly and probably why Restoration Druid has lost a lot of representation in raids in this expansion compared to the previous one. It might be the case of the chicken or the egg. Is Druid losing representation in raids because Resto Shaman is more popular in Mythic Plus? Or is it the opposite? Is it because Restoration Druid isn't more popular in Mythic Plus anymore that more Druids are dropping slots from raids? I don't know. I don't know which one came first. Maybe they came at the same time. Now we have to look, though, at the top 3 healers. Again, the same 3. They are the top 3, but there has been a shift in power. The power balance have shifted because now of the 3, Holy Paladin is at the bottom of the 3. You can argue in certain bosses, for certain things, they are still the best because of the damage they can bring, and because of the 3, they are the more durable with an immunity, a double immunity if you want to count physical damage and Blessing of Protection as well. So they can bring still something extra than the other 2 specs can't. But tit for tat, purely Shadowlands versus BfA, they are weaker. They are a weaker version of their BfA version. In BfA, they were the strongest ever since they have gotten their Glimmer of Light build running. Remember that Glimmer as an Azerite trait was available before they started scaling, and nobody took it. Nobody cared about Glimmer. In fact, it was considered a meme. Only after, when they got their Exodia pieces all in place, they started rolling. The thing with Holy Paladin is that a lot of time there is this idea that if you want to have a lot of healing, a lot of HPS, you're not going to be having strong cooldowns, strong damage reduction, because you're bringing a lot of HPS, and vice versa. If you have a lot of damage reduction, your HPS, your throughput isn't very high. This is true, for example, for Discipline Priest. Discipline Priest, even in BfA, didn't have very high HPS. They were basically one of the strongest specs still, but HPS wasn't their strong suit. Keeping up an entire raid over a 3-minute long fight of consistent damage taken wasn't their specialty. A boss like Shadar, for example, was not their specialty. Holy Paladin in BfA was essentially breaking the mold. Holy Paladin in BfA had the ability to have a damage reduction ability like Devotion Aura with Aura Mastery, and very high HPS. The deeper we went into the expansion, the higher it went, because the more uptime on their Avenging Wrath, on their wings, that they had. And because Glimmer of Light was in a much more unbalanced state than it is now. Now, Glimmer of Light with Holy Paladin is capped at 8. So now they have a limit on how much they can spam their Holy Shock, tag multiple players, and then get lots of AoE healing for very high HPS. Which is why you see in this type of healing profile, this is what Holy Paladin looks like. You wouldn't have seen this very long line of Light of Dawn in BfA, because it got to the point where Holy Paladins didn't even bother to cast Light of Dawn anyways, because it was inefficient. Holy Shock was just better. Now Holy Shock caps at 8 targets. Light of Dawn is a better ability, it's been buffed as well in overall healing, so it is just worth to use. But as you can see, not too much has changed. It's still mostly just about Holy Shock and Light of Dawn together. And of course, you do kind of want to spend your holy power anyways, so you might as well cast Light of Dawn now. They are, of course, if they are running with Glimmer build, they are running with Shock Barrier, which is the other decent chunk of healing they are doing. And Holy Paladin is pretty healthy now. I think this is the balanced version of an unbalanced build from BfA. Now they do have Aura Mastery, which is a strong cooldown, and they have Avenging Wrath, which for healing purposes on a Holy Paladin is a very strong cooldown as well. So they have two. In their talent build, they can actually get even more cooldowns to be even more versatile if they want to, because Holy Paladins can still go for Holy Avenger, which is another very powerful cooldown, especially when you pair it with Awakening, which is one of the more used talents for Holy Paladin. When you go into Holy Avenger, you can actually damn near guarantee Avenging Wrath procs very often because of how much Holy Power you're actually spending inside of Holy Avenger. Again, same point as before, they just have more options for their cooldowns. They do also have pretty nice and easy ramp up at the cost of a strong cooldown. The fact that they are not Ventir for Ashen Hallow isn't too powerful for a Holy Paladin compared to a Red Paladin, for example. Instead, they can go for Divine Toll, which is very easy to set up 5 Holy Shocks instantly on a 1 minute cooldown is very handy. So right now, it does fit very well in Castornatria with the amount of cooldowns they have and the throughput, which has been lowered. Yes, it is a weaker version than the BfA one, but it is still pretty nice, pretty healthy, and they are kept up still by the fact that they have damage reduction in their toolkit. Now we have to look at the top two. We have to look at how our Restoration Shaman and Discipline Priest doing and why, and we have to start with Restoration Shaman. I do think that Discipline Priest is actually stronger, but we will talk about this later. Restoration Shaman is actually in a bizarre world right now. If you haven't paid attention to healers, I show you this and you're like, yeah, you know, classic Resto Shaman. Just dump a bunch of chain heals and get a ton of healing, right? The rest of the healing is on their strong cooldowns. Their Healing Tide, their Cloudburst, you know, seems normal. Yes, it is normal because this is what Restoration Shaman has done for a long time, for many expansions, except now we are in Shadowlands and their healing looks like this. If you can't see chain heal anymore, it's not a bug. It's just that it's not there because it's not being casted. That's the answer. With the several round of buffs that Restoration Shaman has received to Healing Wave, and also because generally speaking, Healing Wave is much more mana conservative and better to use in raid encounters, particularly the long and draining raid encounters, and the fact that Riptide also got buffed by quite a bunch, which made their talent Torrent to further increase the healing of the front and healing of Riptide even more. It made them essentially a Riptide spamming machine. They are essentially an halfway hybrid from turning into Resto Druid and Rejuvenation spam. They are only 50% on their way there. They need about 100 more Riptides to catch up with Rejuvenation, but they are getting there. Also, Riptide heals more than Rejuvenation, so it's not the same, but it is basically, again, in a Bizarro world, like BfA, except they have replaced Chain Heal spam with Riptide spam. They will alternate their short, powerful cooldowns every time there is a need to. They have Cloudburst, they have Earthenwall Totem, they are gonna have Wellspring, they have Spirit Link, they have Healing Tide, so those get spread throughout the encounter when the bigger damage window is coming in, and then the rest is gonna be filled with Riptides and Healing Waves. It is a much better way to heal than the previous chain heal spam. Again, it wasn't that hard to make it better, to be honest, but Restoration Shaman is the exact example as why they are so strong in raids. It isn't just Spirit Link. It's very important to point out because I mentioned a few too many times that these three healers are the strongest because they have damage reduction. Shaman is the Holy Paladin of BfA. Holy Paladin in BfA wasn't strong just because they had Aura Mastery. They were strong because on top of having Aura Mastery, they also had very high HPS, which is not common. Shaman is doing the same thing in Shadowlands. While having Spirit Link Totem, which gives you 10% damage reduction and health redistribution, which is possibly even stronger than damage reduction, they also have very high HPS and a slew of cooldowns they can choose to have throughout the encounter. They can have Wellspring, or they can change for even something stronger like Ascendance. They can still keep their Cloudburst, or they can even choose between Ancestral Protection Totem, which is also a 10% health increase, or go for Earthenwall Totem. They still have Healing Tide, so their ability to just use strong cooldowns in all the different phases, and if a phase is particularly nasty, you can just stack multiple cooldowns on top of them. Healing Tide and Earthenwall Totem, or Healing Tide and Ascendance, why not? Just use them when they're needed. This is something many other specs, like Holy Priest, like Mistweaver Monk, just cannot do. They don't have them. That's the first issue that they would have to fix, actually having the option to use cooldowns. And Shaman is just full of them. The problem, you might say, for other healer specs, or the blessing for Shaman this expansion, is that on top of all these cooldowns, they also have very strong HPS. Remember the good old days of BfA when in some encounters, Restoration Shamans were just going Battle Shaman. They were taking Elemental Shaman Azerite traits, DPS essences, DPS trinkets, and basically just doing DPS until they had to click Spirit Link or click Cloudburst and chunk a couple of high tide empowered chain heals and then go back to DPSing. That's how strong their healing was, concentrated into the strong cooldowns, and then outside of them they could just do something else. So taking the long route, this was a long-winded way to say they should be nerfed in their HPS. Now, the last of the healers is going to be Discipline Priest. So this is Discipline Priest. We have to touch on this a little bit because if you don't know much about healers or if you haven't paid attention about the changes and the fact that Discipline Priest has gotten Spirit Shell back, although this is a modified version, if you can believe it, this is even weaker than what they had in Mist of Pandaria. So yeah, good times. Discipline Priest is essentially currently dominated by what we could call an abomination of a combo. I have wailed and bitched about this the first time I saw this. So they have Spirit Shell, right? Which is going to turn your Atonement healing into an Absorb Shield. Very simple. 10 seconds. You try before you press this button to spread as many Atonements on as many raid members as you can. And then you click this and you start your damage window, your burst window. So the more damage you do, the more it's going to get converted into an Absorb Shield before a big hit, before a massive hit. That's the logic. The legendary is going to reinforce this combo. Clarity of Mind is going to increase the duration of all your atonements by 3 seconds, as well as reducing the mana cost of your damaging abilities by 30%. And this is the current problem, I think, when it comes to healers. Every time there is a big damage window, a Discipline Priest is going to be able to chunk out 6 to 8 different Power Word shields and then cast 2 Power Word Radiances. This is going to allow them to tag nearly 14 to 15 people in the raid. After they do that, they click Spirit Shell. Spirit Shell is going to increase the duration of all atonements by 4 seconds because it gets further increased by their Exaltation Conduit. So even the ones that had 1 second left, they started 15 seconds ago. There was only 1 second left. You click Spirit Shell, it gets extended by 4 seconds. In these 4 seconds, with your Trinket, your Ray Shell, whatever you have, you chunk your Schism, your Penance, your Mind Blast, as much damage as you can, to create a very heavy, massive shield for the incoming heavy boss damage phase. This was oppressive in Mists of Pandaria, and no surprise, it's oppressive now. The main problem, since we talk about the flexibility of cooldowns, the reason why this is a disaster is because it's a 1-minute cooldown. Not only Discipline Priests were already meta because they had Power Word Barrier, which allowed them to, get into the damage reduction train, and because in BfA, Priests were already doing this. Priests were already doing this entire rotation, except they didn't have Spirit Shell. In BfA, they were simply trying to tag as many people as possible with Atonement, wait for the damage, and then do their damage rotation to heal it up with Atonement. Now, it's even more annoying. It's even more disruptive for other healers because they're just going to absorb the damage taken. So this combo makes them extremely powerful. The barrier, which was already a staple in healing, recoupled again with Spirit Shell. This is why Discipline and Restoration Shaman are the safest combo of healers you can use in raids right now. If you have a 5 healers roster in your group, pretty much the best setup you can have is double Shaman, double Disc, 1 Holy Paladin. That's just it. There are going to be some bosses where the extra damage of the Holy Paladin is going to make it better to have 2 of them, but for the majority of the fights, that's the combo you want to go with. You're going to have so many cooldowns that you can spread in so many situations that are going to cover them better than what all the other specs can do. When you can imagine, 6 or 7 hard phases to cover with cooldowns, and instead you have double Holy Priest, double Mistweaver, and 1 Resto Druid, it doesn't look good. So for the last part of this video, after going over the healers and why they are doing well in raid right now, we have to look at the actual damage from the bosses. So numbers, lines, graphs. Just touching on this because the video is already pretty long. When you talk about healers, you also have to talk inevitably about the boss, because the healing is only happening based on what type of damage the boss is doing. Otherwise, it's only based on how the encounters are designed that certain healers are stronger than others. Essentially, yeah, it's all in the hands of Blizzard. Not just in how powerful they make a spec, but also how the encounter is going to work. For example, if I showed you a fight like this one, bonus points if you understand the fight, but this fight doesn't have any powerful, strong situation where you want Spirit Link or Barrier. right? The damage doesn't even break 50,000 damage taken per second, which is pretty low. So yeah, of course, if you're a Resto Shaman, you're still gonna use Link in the fight, but it's not really that necessary. Since I made the example before, this is a type of fight where 2 Mistweaver Monks, 2 Holy Priests, and 1 Resto Druid are gonna be just fine. In fact, they're gonna be straight up better than 2 Discipline Priests, 2 Resto Shamans, and 1 Holy Paladin, because pure raw throughput in a fight like this is better. There is no important phase you want to stack healing cooldowns on. Meanwhile, we have a fight, an abomination, like this one. So, when you look at a damage profile like this, first of all, not only are there spikes, but look at the 50,000 line. Pretty much every single one of the spikes breaks the 50,000 range, and at least 3 of them go above 75,000. These are the walls on Council of Blood. This type of fight is the fight where you want damage reduction. It doesn't even matter if your pure throughput spec was 20% more healing than a damage reduction spec. You do want Barrier here, and Spirit Link, or a Mastery, because of how much damage these spikes can do. Another example, funnily enough, is the Natrius. The Natrius barely even breaks 60,000 damage taken per second as a type of fight. Compare it with a low IQ type of boss like Sludgefist. The Natrius basically doesn't even break 60,000, and look at Sludgefist. 40% of the fight is basically above 60,000 damage taken per second. Continuous damage. This is another fight where a spec with very high throughput is going to be doing very well, because you don't necessarily need that many damage reduction cooldowns on Sludgefist. You do need them, you do still need them, they are still good, but for example, the current highest HPS on this fight is going to Resto Druids, because this is a great fight for them. There is constant, and I mean constant, pretty tough damage on the boss done to the entire raid, so a Restoration Druid is perfect for this. A Discipline Priest prepping a Spirit Shell is not gonna find as much value as he did in Council of Blood when he does this on Sludgefist. Yes, he will be able to on the 4 pillars, and the heavy damage that he does on the pillars, but outside of the pillars, there are not going to be that many other windows. It's just going to be heavy, consistent damage all the time. So it does also depend on the type of damage that Blizzard is going to develop. Because if Blizzard developed all the fights to be closer to the Inerva, that was the boss, where the damage is more consistent, like Sludgefist, or even like Stone Legion, which is like this one. Very stable, very consistent, never above 60,000 damage taken, as opposed to a good old fight like this one. Very many spikes, which is Shadar. So it is also in the hands of Blizzard how a spec is balanced. It's not just that Holy Priest is weak. Holy Priest is weak because Blizzard has developed fights that make other specs better, which is different. This is not an invitation to blame Blizzard, although you will do anyways, either because the spec is weak or because the bosses are not balanced for the spec, so they're gonna get blamed either way. I don't care. What I do care though is hearing some possible solutions to this, because the video is done. We have recapped the healers and their state in raids, and it is clear that the main problem of the healers that are underperforming, or maybe not given the chance to perform, is that they lack the appropriate cooldowns to match within a raid. It isn't just a case that, yes, damage reduction pays off a lot in these fights, but when you also go and look at all these types of healers, the healer with the better cooldowns, shorter cooldowns, more usable on all the different high damage phases are Shaman, Discipline, and Holy Paladin. So the solution could be to either call it quits on this type of balancing and just give every healer a damage reduction ability, so we are done with this, or to maybe reduce the cooldown as well as increase the amount of cooldown available for these specs, because it does seem pretty weird that a spec like Restoration Shaman has 2 to 3 times the amount of cooldowns of a Mistweaver Monk while also having damage reduction, right? So it seems a little bit unfair. So let me know what you guys think. What could be the solution? Trust me, the answers like nerf Discipline and nerf Resto Shaman is not going to fix anything. Nerfing Discipline is not going to take away their Barrier and their Spirit Shell. So yeah, they can still be nerfed, but we need some more drastic changes other than nerfs. Let me guys know, and we will see each other probably tomorrow for another video. Nobody knows about what. We will see. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, damage reduction for everyone.